All right, get ready to dive deep because today we're tackling affirmative action, something that's kept philosophers talking for decades.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at it, like a philosopher would, thinking about where it came from, what people say for and against it, and how it's changed over time.
Gotcha.
Our main source for this exploration is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on affirmative action,
Oh,
which has tons of interesting info and arguments.
nice.
So what even is affirmative action, and why does it seem to cause so many arguments?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia says affirmative action is positive steps taken to increase the representation of women and minorities
Right.
in areas of employment, education, and culture from which they have been historically excluded.
Makes sense.
Yeah, sounds simple, but the controversy really comes down to what those positive steps actually are,
I bet.
especially when it comes to preferential selection based on race, gender, or ethnicity.
Yeah, that's when people start taking sides and debating fairness, merit, what equality really means.
Exactly.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia, they've got this helpful visual showing the history of this debate in like 3 spikes of controversy.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's like a timeline of how things got heated over time.
Got it.
So that first spike back in the 70s was all about employment.
Yeah.
There's this thing called Revised Order Number 4, which basically meant universities getting federal funds
Okay.
had to step up their game in hiring more women and minorities, especially as professors.
Wow.
Back then, most professors were white men, so you can imagine.
Right, yeah.
This really shook things up.
Big time.
So that spike won affirmative action and hiring?
Okay.
What about the other 2 spikes?
Well, spikes 2 and 3 happened later, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Uh-huh.
And this time, the focus shifted to college admissions.
Oh, interesting.
Cases like Bake, Grutter, Fisher, and most recently, Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard all brought this debate to the forefront, each one shaping how we view affirmative action in education.
So now let's put on our philosopher hats and dive into some core arguments.
I'm ready.
2 big names come up early on.
Okay.
Judith Jarvis Thomson and her argument about redress for past wrongs, and Thomas Nagel, who was more focused on achieving social good.
Interesting.
So it's fascinating how these 2 philosophers approach this.
Right.
Thomson saw affirmative action as a way to kind of compensate for historical injustices, making things right,
I see.
She argued that giving certain groups a leg up could help balance the scales that have been tipped against them for so long.
Right. Makes sense.
Nagel, though, he took a different approach,
Okay.
suggesting that affirmative action could be justified by the positive outcomes it might produce for society as a whole, even if it doesn't perfectly match up with ideas of individual merit or desert.
Okay.
So on one hand, it's about righting past wrongs, and on the other, it's about creating a better future. What do you think, listener? Which side feels more compelling so far?
It is a tricky question.
It is.
Not a simple yes or no situation, right? There are nuances and critiques to consider.
Of course.
For example, some people say that Thompson's approach, while well-meaning, might actually end up benefiting those who were least harmed by past injustices,
That's a good point.
while burdening those who had the least to do with causing them.
Interesting.
It's like, are we punishing the wrong people?
Yeah. So is there a response to that critique? Does anyone address that potential imbalance?
Well, yes. Some philosophers argue that affirmative action, even with preferential treatment, can still lead to a fairer system overall.
Okay.
Marianne Warren, for instance, she argues that in a system already full of discrimination, the advantages some people have often aren't truly earned,
Okay.
while others face systemic barriers regardless of their abilities.
Makes sense.
It's like trying to have a fair race where some runners start way ahead of the others
Yeah.
and some have to carry heavy weights. It's hard to call that a level playing field.
Right. Yeah.
And James Rachel's made a similar point, arguing that racial preferences could help to even out those unearned advantages that white people have enjoyed because of historical and social privilege. He argued that those impressive credentials, often presented by white applicants, might not really reflect greater effort or ability,
Okay.
but simply the luck of being born white.
Wow. So this brings us to a question that often gets thrown around. Reverse discrimination.
Ah, yes.
And how do we unpack that?
Reverse discrimination, it's definitely a term that carries a lot of weight, both philosophically and emotionally.
For sure.
It's often used to argue that affirmative action basically does a flip. and ends up discriminating against those who haven't been historically disadvantaged.
Right, like white men.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
some people are saying, hold on, two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah,
How can we fight discrimination with, well, more discrimination?
exactly.
Philosopher Lisa Newton, for example, she made a strong comparison to Jim Crow laws, arguing that favoring women and minorities is just as unjust as the systematic discrimination of the past.
Interesting.
And then you have thinkers like William Bennett and Terry Eastland, who echo that sentiment, claiming that using race to end racism is just illogical.
Right.
They argue that by even considering race in decision-making, you're perpetuating the very problem you're trying to solve.
Makes sense.
So how do we untangle this? Is there a way to achieve equality without what some see as just another form of discrimination?
Yeah.
It's a real philosophical puzzle.
It really is, and it leads us to the heart of the debate, the principle of equality itself.
Go.
Trying to come up with a universal definition of equality that consistently says no to racial preferences, it's really tricky.
Yeah, so does that mean there's no situation where giving someone an advantage based on race is ethically okay?
Right.
Or does any use of race automatically create an unfair system?
Philosophers have been grappling with that for ages.
I bet.
Carl Cohen, for example, he tried to use that classic Aristotelian principle, treating equals equally, to argue against any kind of racial preference.
Aristotle, always a good starting point.
Right.
But how does that ancient wisdom apply to something as complex as affirmative action?
Well, Cohen argued that it's always wrong to give one group an advantage just because of physical characteristics that aren't relevant to the situation.
Sounds reasonable at first,
Yeah.
but I've learned that in philosophy there's always a but.
Oh, always.
So what's the catch here?
The problem is figuring out what relevance really means in this context.
Okay,
Cohen admits that there are cases where physical characteristics do matter, like giving special assistance to elderly people
Yeah.
or people with disabilities.
right.
So age or disability is considered relevant in those cases.
Okay, but why is race any different?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Cohen argues that those other examples, helping the elderly or those with disabilities, are justified because they're directly related to the purpose of the policy, which is to make sure people aren't disadvantaged due to factors they can't control.
So it's not about the characteristic itself, but about how it connects to the goal.
Exactly.
The relevance depends on what you're trying to achieve.
Right, and this takes us back to the famous Bake case and the clash between Justices Powell and Brennan.
Oh, yeah, Bake.
Do you remember that one?
Vaguely, it was back in law school.
Oh, right.
Remind me how those two legal giants viewed affirmative action.
Well, Justice Powell, he wrote the majority opinion, and he was all about having that clear, absolute principle. No racial classifications, period.
No exception.
Nope. But Justice Brennan had a different view.
I'm guessing Brennan was more open to nuance and context.
Exactly.
Okay.
He believed that equality should be understood as an anti-caste principle.
Anti-caste meaning.
Basically, it's about preventing any group from being systematically pushed down into an inferior position because of things like race or ancestry.
So for Brennan, it was less about treating everyone exactly the same and more about ensuring no one's stuck at a disadvantage because of prejudice or historical oppression.
Exactly.
Got it.
And then we have another brilliant legal mind, Ronald Dworkin, who made this fascinating distinction between the right to equal treatment and the right to treatment as an equal.
Ooh. Okay, those sound similar, but I'm sure there's a crucial difference.
There is.
That helps clarify this whole debate.
Yeah. Lay it on me.
The right to equal treatment means everyone gets the same treatment in situations like voting.
One person, one vote.
Right, where everyone's vote counts the same.
Got it.
But the right to treatment as an equal acknowledges that sometimes we need to consider differences to ensure fairness.
So sometimes treating everyone the same can actually lead to unequal outcomes if we don't account for those differences.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Dworkin argued that the real injustice is disadvantaging someone based on prejudice or societal biases, not in recognizing that those disadvantages exist.
It's like saying that giving everyone the same size shoes doesn't create equality if some people have much bigger feet than others.
Perfect analogy. So, listener, how about you? Does this treatment as an equal idea change your perspective at all?
It's definitely a powerful concept that challenges us to think beyond simplistic ideas of equality.
And I'm curious, how does this all play out in the real world, especially when it comes to affirmative action in college admissions?
Well, even though the Bake decisions seem to reject using quotas, the concept of diversity emerged as a major justification for affirmative action in universities.
So even after Bake, universities still found a way to justify considering race.
They did.
How did that happen?
Well, it is a bit of a head scratcher,
Yeah.
Even though Powell struck down that quota system in Bake, he kind of left this opening, like a crack in the door, for considering race as part of this bigger goal of diversity in the classroom.
Ah, so universities kind of jumped on that, right? They started arguing that having a diverse student body was super important for a good education.
Exactly. And that led to cases like Grutter and Gratz, which, really shaped how affirmative action works in college admissions, legally speaking.
But like we talked about earlier, there seems to be a lot of wiggle room in how diversity is actually defined and used.
For sure, Justice O'Connor, who wrote the majority opinion in Grutter, she seemed to be okay with the idea that racial diversity had like a special value in education,
Hmm.
even though, Powell seemed to resist that in Bokde. It's subtle, but it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, so is it really about considering all kinds of diversity equally? Or is there like an unspoken preference for racial diversity above others?
That's exactly where some critics say, hold up, this is a sham. Justice Scalia, for example, he was very vocal in his dissent in Grutter, arguing that all this talk about individualized consideration was meaningless if the end goal was still the same, a certain racial balance.
Right, it's like saying you're picking flowers for their unique beauty, but you're secretly making sure you get the right number of red ones and yellow
Yeah,
ones.
exactly.
It makes you wonder, does focusing on each applicant as an individual really matter? Or is it just a way to hide a policy that's really about hitting a specific racial makeup? What do you think, listener? Does that individualized consideration argument hold up, or does it feel kind of like a smokescreen?
It's a big question, and it really shows that tension between wanting a truly holistic evaluation and the reality of a system that still sees race as this important factor.
Okay, let's shift gears for a minute and look at an argument that doesn't get as much attention. The legitimacy argument.
Mhm.
This one goes beyond the idea that diversity helps individual students and focuses on how affirmative action affects institutions as a whole.
Right. This is where things get really interesting. The legitimacy argument says that affirmative action isn't just about what's going on in students' heads, it's about making sure the institutions themselves are seen as legit and trustworthy by the public.
So it's not just about students getting diverse perspectives, but about institutions mirroring the diversity of the society they're part of?
Exactly. A great example of this is from the Grutter case. Remember that brief filed by those retired military officers?
Refresh my memory.
Well, they argued that having racial preferences was super important for maintaining a racially integrated officer corps, which in turn was essential for the military's legitimacy, both inside and outside the ranks.
Yeah, so if the leadership doesn't reflect the diversity of the people they lead, it's hard to see them as truly representative.
Exactly. And Justice O'Connor, in her Grutter opinion, she picked up on that argument and applied it not just to the military, but to other institutions like law schools and even the Supreme Court itself.
Wow. She even pointed out how since the 1960s, presidents have been very aware of the racial and gender makeup of the Supreme Court when making appointments, often to like maintain its legitimacy in a diverse nation.
It's interesting how this awareness of representation plays out at such high levels. It kind of suggests that diversity isn't just some abstract ideal, but something practically necessary for institutions to work well and be seen as legitimate.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this legitimacy argument might actually be more persuasive than that traditional diversity rationale.
Hmm.
Is it more convincing to say we need affirmative action so institutions mirror the society they represent instead of just focusing on what individual students get out of it? What are your thoughts on this, listener?
It's a really thought-provoking question, and it definitely shows how complex affirmative action is, how it works on so many levels, not just impacting individual lives, but the very structure of our social and political systems.
Okay, fast forward to the Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard decision in 2023. It didn't completely overturn Grutter, but it did put some limits on using race in college admissions.
Yeah, SFFA was a landmark decision, even if it wasn't that knockout punch some people were expecting.
Right.
It's interesting how Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion, he specifically said military academies don't have to follow those limits.
That exception really seems to suggest that the legitimacy argument might be gaining traction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If the military needs affirmative action to make sure its leadership reflects the diversity of its ranks, Maybe other institutions can make a similar case.
It's definitely possible. And since the SFFA decision, we're seeing more focus on other things that might create an unfair advantage in admissions, like legacy preferences and standardized testing.
Those debates are back in full swing.
Yeah.
There's this growing feeling that giving preferential treatment to kids of alumni, those legacy admissions, is just fundamentally unfair,
Right.
and that it just keeps privilege going.
Exactly.
The Wall Street Journal had a great article on this recently, and there are even bills in Congress trying to ban legacy admissions entirely.
Wow.
It seems like the SFFA decision has sparked a much bigger conversation about what a level playing field in college admissions really means.
Yeah.
It also makes us question this whole idea of meritocracy, right?
Mhm.
Like Michael Sandel talks about in his work. Merit can be a really loaded term, often hiding deeper inequalities that already exist in society.
So true. If we just get rid of affirmative action without addressing those underlying inequalities, have we really made things fairer? Or have we just shifted the advantage from one group to another?
It's the big question, isn't it? If we're serious about equal opportunity, we need to go beyond just eliminating one form of preference and deal with those systemic issues that create an uneven playing field right from the start. This has been a really dense but super interesting look at affirmative action and all the philosophical dilemmas it brings up.
It really is a fascinating topic.
It is. What stands out to you most, listener?
Well, affirmative action really sits at the crossroads of history, law, and philosophy.
For sure.
And it makes us face some uncomfortable truths about privilege, equality, and justice. As we move away from race-conscious admissions, the huge question is, what can we actually do to make sure these elite institutions really serve everyone? And is that even what we should be aiming for? Lots to think about.
Lots to think about. And for anyone who wants to keep digging, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry we used is a goldmine of resources and different viewpoints.
Oh, yeah, it's a great place to start.
It's clear this conversation isn't going away anytime soon, so keep those questions coming, keep learning, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.